So the first time I visited Penn, I was 15, and it rained, and I decided I would never ever come here because it was awful here. And I've since sort of realized that, well, there's just one facet, and this is actually an incredible place with incredible people, and I'm so grateful to Martha for basically bringing me here. So today I'm going to start my talk with the question that frames all of my research, which is how does the gap in academic achievement between kids who have very little and kids who have a lot arise? And I think that this question has been looked at from a variety of angles, from economics, from sociology, from education, but neuroscience is relatively new to the table. And so I hope to convince you that neuroscience can help us understand the mechanisms of the income achievement gap, but also help us make progress towards narrowing it. And the first thing I'd like you to do is to think about how the worlds of these two children are so very different. So in addition to income, so high income for this child, lower income for this child, we can think about all of the environmental exposures that having access to wealth would convey. So for example, this child is less likely to experience stress, more likely to experience rich and complex language, and more likely to attend high-quality schools, though there are notable exceptions, and I'll get to those towards the end of my talk. And so what we do in my lab is we think about these environmental exposures, and we really focus on psychological and social exposures, though we're beginning to get interested in physical exposures too, and so I'll come back to that at the end, thinking about things like lead and air pollution, right? So a child who grows up in a wealthy home is more likely to have clean air, clean water, high nutrition foods, and so we have to consider those environmental influences as well. But for the bulk of my talk, I'll be thinking about psychosocial influences, how these influences shape the developing brain, and ultimately how the brain gives rise to cognitive skills that are critical for performance in school. Most of the data that I'll be showing you is cross-sectional, and so it's inherently correlational. We'll be looking at relations between these kinds of measures, but ultimately what my lab really wants to know is if we causally change the environment, how does that change the brain and ultimately change the mind? Okay, so today I'm going to begin with just an overview of the methods that we use in my lab. I'll focus on each of these factors: income, stress, language, and school quality. And I'll end by discussing whether educational interventions are likely to be able to ameliorate some of the effects of negative early experiences. Okay, so starting with the methods. In our lab, we rely heavily on neuroimaging, and neuroimaging methods sort of cluster into these four quadrants. We can think about brain structure and brain function, local properties of neural areas, and the connection between these areas. So starting with this quadrant up here, you can think about a patch of cortex, a patch of the brain, and what we'll be measuring is the distance from the outside of the brain to the gray-white boundary, and we call that cortical thickness. Over the course of development, we initially make way too many connections, and then we prune away the ones we don't know. So cortical thickness is a proxy measure for that developmental process, and is linked, we think, in some ways to plasticity, the changeability of these areas. We can also look at subcortical volume. Today you'll see data on the volume of the hippocampus, a learning structure, but you can also look at the amygdala, striatum, any of these kinds of volumes. If we then think about local function, and we think about that same patch of cortex, its blood oxygen level is just naturally fluctuating. It might look like this. But if we make somebody do a task while they're in the scanner, then we know kind of what they're doing, right? And we can see how well our model of the task fits that blood oxygen fluctuation. I believe I won't focus so much on this method today. If we, instead of looking at one patch of cortex, look at two, we can extract the blood oxygen from each of them and see how well they correlate with each other. If those time courses are tightly interwoven, then we infer that they're part of the same network. Finally, we can think about structural connectivity and think about the axons that connect these two patches of cortex. Right? They might look something like this. And we'll use MRI to look at diffusion of water between these two patches of cortex. So Water would like to flow along the axons and not through the myelin, so we can compare this diffusion to the two orthogonal directions. We'll come back to these, and I'll reintroduce them as I get to this data, but I just wanted you to have a framework to begin with. The reason that these kinds of connectivity measures have become so important is that there's more and more data suggesting that the brain is organized into these big networks that span the entire cortex. So just looking at one patch isn't going to tell us the full story. And that each of these networks develops at a different time. Right? So these canonical curves come from DeCalhoun's work at the molecular level, but we sort of infer what this might look like in humans. And what we see is that the visual areas in purple at the back of the brain develop first. Just to orient you, this is the lateral surface of the brain, like right here. This is the front, this is the back, the eyeball would be right here. And then if you split the brain open right in the middle, it's less gruesome than it sounds because these are just pictures, we would see something like this. Okay, so visual areas develop first, then we see that motor areas develop next, and then the last two networks to develop are important for abstract thought. Those are the pink network here, here's the default mode network, and the orange network here, which is the executive control or frontoparietal network. The orange network is primarily concerned with what's going on outside of you. So if you're trying to solve problems or do math, you're using your orange network. If you're thinking about your past or your future or trying to control your emotions, then you're using the pink network a little bit more. Most of the studies that I'll show you today have data specifically in these two networks, but you'll see that some others focus on the entire brain all at the same time. What's exciting or frustrating, depending on the day of the week, about these canonical curves is that we actually don't know how to label these axes yet, right? So we don't know when the window of peak plasticity for these abstract thought networks might be. We don't know the best way to measure that. And then ultimately, what I'd like to discover is how individual differences in experiences might shorten or shift these networks, okay, or even change the amplitude. Okay, so we're making very slow progress on this question, but hopefully I can give a talk in 10 years and know a little bit more, maybe 20. So to begin with, the environmental feature I'd like to focus on is income because it is so very broad and because we know the most about it so far. And the structure of this initial study is trying to understand the links between family income and academic achievement by seeing if cortical thickness helps us with this explanation. So we're going to look at adolescents, and they either receive free or reduced price lunch, or they do not. So this is data that we can pull straight from a state database. It's not self-report. The free or reduced price lunch group, those families earn less than about $40,000 a year for families of 4. About over 50% of all public school children in the United States earn or have free or reduced price lunch. Okay. So when I first started this kind of research, I heard from a lot of scientists, well, this is a fringe problem. How many kids could really be affected by this? More than half. And we have a paid lunch group as well. We looked at cortical thickness using structural MRI. The sequence that we used was designed by Dylan Tisdall, who's now at Penn, which we're very lucky that he's here, to have very high quality images even when participants move. We made sure that the quality of those images was not related to family income or to academic achievement. And then we did these cortical thickness measurements at every point in the surface. Finally, we linked to standardized middle school test scores that was a composite of math and English, again, that were acquired through that state database. So before I show you the data, I want to just emphasize what we already knew about links between family income and brain structure. So a lot of this work was pioneered by Martha, where she showed that family income and parental education were both linked. So lower socioeconomic status was linked to less brain volume. But several of those studies said, okay, the effects are in prefrontal cortex because it's so sensitive to stress and so sensitive to language. So at the outset of the study, that was exactly what I was expecting to find. Let's first look at the test score differences between groups. In blue, you see the distribution of the higher income group, the paid lunch group. And you can see that the distribution straddles the advanced and the proficient categories of test scores in Massachusetts. The lower income distribution is shifted down to straddle proficient and needs improvement. And you might wonder about these kids down here. And they may be kids with high income and low test scores, but another way that you could fall into the higher income category is if your parents didn't file the paperwork for you to get free lunch. And that happens more and more frequently as kids get older. So that's a possibility for the stingray distribution, but what you can see is that they're very separate distributions. Let's next look to the brain. I'm going to plot differences in this cortical thickness measure between the groups, and the areas that show up in warm colors are going to be areas where the cortex is thicker in the kids who have higher income families. What I noticed right away is that the story was not just prefrontal cortex. In fact, when we look at the networks that I showed you previously, it's very hard to map these areas onto specific networks. We see differences in visual areas. We see differences in somatosensation. So the story of just differences in language and stress regions doesn't fit this data very well. If we next look at where cortical thickness is related to test performance, we see a similar distributed set of regions, including some visual areas here, some somatosensory areas here. So thicker cortex in these areas is related to better performance on tests of math and language, even if you then control for income. So why do we see this pattern of results? Okay. So basically, for these lower income students, they may have thinner cortex for one or two reasons. So one possibility is that they just had less gray matter from very early on. There was less initial proliferation of these neurons. A second possibility is that cortex in these kids is thinning more quickly. So why might we worry about faster thinning? Well, we have other research suggesting that very slow brain development is associated with better cognitive skills. So developing too quickly might be problematic. You might be sacrificing some plasticity at the expense of, because you're trying to develop too quickly. This finding has been replicated in a large sample, showing that this thinning process is indeed faster for kids from lower SES backgrounds, and that those differences are at the widest in this age range that we studied. I think this also aligns with other work suggesting faster aging more generally in individuals from low SES backgrounds, so earlier puberty, faster shortening of telomeres, the end caps of chromosomes, faster epigenetic changes that are associated with age. So we might be seeing sort of global faster aging going on here. At the same time, there have been several studies that have found SES differences in gray matter starting in infancy. Right, so we might see some of both. Initial differences followed by differences in developmental trajectories. So far, this has been entirely a structural story. Ursula, who's a PhD student here, has been really interested in how SES might impact the timing of functional brain development. And she's been doing some really nice work with Danny Bassett here, looking at the Philadelphia neurodevelopmental cohort, which was collected, led by Ruben and Raquel Gore with Ted Satterthwaite. So let me tell you about one of many approaches that she's taken so far. She's done a lot of work in her first 2 years here. Here you can see the brain tiled with lots of tiny bubbles. What she's going to do is look at the time courses, those blood oxygen time courses, of each pair of those bubbles and see how tightly they are connected. From that information, she can construct a network. And one of the network properties she can look at is how well clustered these regions are. So in this example here, this, I was going to say person, it's not a person, it's a triangle. You can also think of it as a neuron, has many neighbors, but none of those neighbors talk to each other. There's not a lot of clustering here. If we fast forward in developmental time, we might see that now this guy has fewer neighbors, but the neighbors do talk to each other. And what emerges from this are modules. So we have this module and this module. So as kids grow up, the clustering coefficient goes up. And you can think about that as a process of differentiating cortex. Right? At the beginning, there's sort of a lot of cortex that can do a lot of different things. But through experience, you sort of start to set up your orange network and your pink network and your purple network. And those networks sort of behave like modules. So she was curious about the impact of socioeconomic status on this process. And what she found is for the high socioeconomic status group in blue, that they started lower than the lower SES group. If you were to sort of infer this at age 10, to think about earlier than age 10, but past age 20, then they're higher. So this is a faster developmental trajectory for the higher SES group, and the lower SES group is a little bit flatter. So we don't yet know the mechanism for this, but one idea is that if you have sort of a slow process of brain construction with a lot of proliferation of connections early on, you have more dynamic range in terms of how the environment might shape cortex over the course of development. What's interesting is that this pattern is present in all of the different networks, and I can show you those if you ask later, but it's not just specific to networks for abstract thought. It's really a global property. So it aligns with the cortical thickness data in the sense that SES is linked to the development of the entire brain and not just specific networks. And that might be because income is so broad, and it sort of conveys risk and advantages for so many different environmental exposures. So what we'd like to do in the lab is to start to drill down to specific mechanisms. So the next study I'll tell you about, we're looking specifically at stress exposure, sort of above and beyond just socioeconomic status. And this work is led by Ann Park, who's a second-year graduate student in psychology. And she was curious about the impact of adversity, so experiencing stressful life events early in childhood. That would include things like witnessing violence, having a family member who's sick in the hospital, divorce, these kinds of events. I've been asked before, does this really happen to kids between the ages of 4 and 7? And the answer is yes, a lot of it. That's not good news, but that's the way the data shakes out. And she was interested in whether we started to see the footprint of adversity on the medial prefrontal amygdala circuit at this early age. So the amygdala is important for processing threat and salience more generally, so both positive and negative environmental stimuli. And the medial prefrontal cortex is important for regulating the amygdala. So across several studies of older kids and adults, we've seen this link between adversity and this network. And then we've seen in those older ages that this particular connectivity is related to mental health risk. So the approach that she's going to take is she's going to extract the blood oxygen level from the amygdala, see how it fluctuates over time, and see where the amygdala's connectivity relates to experiencing adversity. And what she found is really an area that's limited to medial prefrontal cortex only. So higher stress reduced connectivity between the medial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, sort of suggesting reduced emotion regulation. And what we see is that this brain marker is related to both higher aggression and more attention problems. So I started the talk sort of with an emphasis on the income achievement gap. And you might wonder how this fits in. I think possibly the greater attention problems is more clear, but I think it's important to think about aggression as well. One of the big differences, according to income, are things like suspensions and expulsions. Right? So being able to control your emotions, not get mad, not pick fights, is actually very important to doing well in school. Okay. To shift gears a little bit, now I want to focus on language exposure And this is work led by Rachel Romeo, who's finishing up her PhD at MIT right now. And she was curious about how language exposure shaped the neural circuits responsible for language processing, which in turn give rise to individual differences in language ability. And what she did is she sent kids home with these little recorders that could be slipped into the front pocket of these special shirts. And she asked kids and parents to just talk normally for, I think, 2 weekend days. She then had kids do a task in the scanner that was very simple. These are young kids. They had to listen to either forward speech or backward speech. I tried to find a clip of it. It's very strange sounding, but it has sort of all of the low-level sensory features of forward speech. That sounds sort of garbled. And then she administered standardized language measures. And what she found was that specifically conversational turns, so the back and forth between the child and the parent, was related to activation of Broca's area during this language processing task, and this area only. This was not just about language quantity, so the number of words mom said, or the number of words kids said. It was really about those contingent interactions that they were picking up in their language. She then found that this particular activation fully mediated the relationship between language exposure, conversational turns, and language ability. So this is cross-sectional, but I do think it suggests that if we were able to develop interventions that scaffolded these interactions between parents and children, we might see changes in this architecture and consequent changes in language ability. Okay. So the next factor I want to look at is school quality. And I said that in general, kids from lower income backgrounds get to go to lower quality schools. And this is in part because property taxes fund schools in this country, but there are notable exceptions. And we were lucky enough to work with a few of them. So this is in collaboration with Julia Leonard, who's also finishing up her PhD, but who's coming here in the fall to be a postdoc in our lab. We're interested in the impact of charter school attendance. I know this is controversial. There are lots of good things about these particular charter schools and lots of bad things, but these sort of over-enrolled high-performance charter schools in Boston consistently move academic achievement, but only in math, not so much in reading. But there's still a lot of variability. So some kids win the lottery, they get to go to these high-quality schools, and they learn a lot from math. Their test scores change a lot. And some kids attend these schools and their test scores don't change very much. And so we're interested in whether any of the brain measurements that we collect at the end of 8th grade, at the end of attendance at the school, are related to these individual differences. And so we focused on hippocampal volume and connectivity because in many of the studies on math, when you are learning new math facts and learning new math algorithms, that process is very much about sort of crystallized knowledge about these systems. You can see in the data that kids who do very well in math have bigger hippocampi and better connectivity between the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. There's actually a study too in 3rd graders showing that kids with a bigger hippocampus and a better connected hippocampus were able to benefit more from a tutoring program. So this kind of circuitry could either change a lot as kids learn, or if kids have this kind of circuitry, they might be able to better benefit from charter school attendance. Okay, so let's first check to make sure that their math scores did go up. This is the charter school group in yellow, and I'm plotting change in standardized math scores. So you can see that for this group, over the course of 3 years, their test scores went up almost a standard deviation. Right? And I've also plotted that same data for the lower income group and the higher income group that I showed you data on earlier. The lower income group started low and stayed low. The higher income group started high and stayed high, didn't change very much, but these kids did see a big change. But there's still considerable variability here. So let's first look at hippocampal volume. What we see is that kids with bigger hippocampus, I'm showing you right, the same is true on the left, show a bigger standardized math change. And we can look to functional connectivity to see how the blood oxygen time course of the hippocampus relates to the rest of the brain and correlates with math gains. And what we see is that kids who have better connectivity between the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, the kids up here, showed a bigger change in math. Okay. So I consider this to be preliminary, but exciting. And it's preliminary because we really don't know whether these neural features are the cause or the consequence of greater learning. So as I said before, having a bigger hippocampus that's better connected to your prefrontal cortex predicts learning more in the future. But there have been other studies in adults suggesting that when adults study really hard for tests of math and science, they show an increase in hippocampal size. And we have seen across several studies changes in functional connectivity with learning. So really, either interpretation is possible. It's probably a combination of both. But I think it's a really important sort of path forward to understand whether these high-quality school environments really do change the brain. Okay. So now I sort of want to look forward and think about how educational interventions might change some of these neural features. And a lot of the work that I have done so far has focused on reasoning. And the reason why is that reasoning is sort of tightly linked with conceptualizations of intelligence. And is therefore thought by many to be set in stone. And it's highly predictive of how kids do in school. Right? So if those two things are true, that's a problem for the kids who are coming into school in kindergarten with low reasoning skills. Sometimes I get the comment that really nobody believes this anymore. We know so much about neuroplasticity. Don't we all know by now that reasoning intelligence can change? The answer is no. And as I was preparing this talk today, I got a text from my mom, which I'm obviously going to share with this audience of eminent strangers. But she basically texted and she said, I'm in a training right now and it says, is it scientifically proven that IQ is static? That's a very relevant question, Mom. So you can see my whole response where I'm like, yeah, I don't, and this is why. And she says, I'm with you, I'll try to weave that in, and try to convince other people that this is true. And I think this is interesting coming from my mom, because I think my mom had a growth mindset before that was even a thing. I think she's always believed that intelligence can change. She grew up very, very poor, so poor that when my dad met her in 5th grade, he only remembers that she had dirty feet because she didn't have shoes. And sort of has worked very hard her whole life, and gotten very lucky her whole life. When I was a kid, she was a waitress and she cleaned houses, and now she's in some horrible corporate training where they're telling her that IQ is fixed. Anyway, I'm sure this is a highly professional story to share. I think it's relevant for where I'm going from here, which is that I really do believe that reasoning can be changed through education. So to test your own reasoning ability, for those of you who can see this, I might ask you a question like this, where I ask you, is the green ball or the red ball heavier? Does anyone know? Referencing these scales above, so for example, this says blue and red are the same. I heard a green. Very clever, yes. So green is heavier than yellow, and yellow is heavier than red. This is just one of many tests that we could give for reasoning ability. And through multiple studies in the scanner, we know that this kind of network helps you do problems like this. So first, you need to see these scales in visual cortex. Then you need to represent each of the scales individually. We think that happens in parietal cortex here in green. Then you need to send that information forward to rostral and lateral prefrontal cortex for the integration of those two scales. Okay? You need to hold that information in mind, and you need to resist pressing the wrong answer, for example. So you can see that in order to do this kind of problem quickly and correctly, you need these areas of the brain to talk to each other. You need to have efficient communication. what I was curious about is whether reasoning experience can change the circuitry and give rise to greater reasoning ability, right? The deltas. And this may be relevant to people in this room, or at least to people in this building, but I discovered that taking the test, the LSAT, the law school admissions test, actually was a pretty good way to learn to reason. Has anyone taken the LSAT in this room? No. Well, we'll ask our neighbors upstairs. These problems are these elaborate reasoning problems where you have to integrate not information about colored balls, but integrate verbal rules. And people study like crazy for this. They study like over 100 hours over 3 months. It's highly motivating, highly novel. And what we see are indeed changes in frontal parietal connectivity. So we see that these areas in dark red show the most changes within this network. So people who take the LSAT as compared to controls show the biggest changes here. And we can also look at that structural connectivity data and see changes in these green areas here that connect left and right prefrontal cortex. Changes that in white matter that connect cortex to subcortical areas as reasoning becomes more automatic and more fluid. And changes right neocortex in prefrontal cortex and parietal cortex. So these data link up across functional connectivity and structural connectivity to suggest that when people learn to reason better, their brains really do change. Okay, so these are high-performing adults. It's a little bit further from what I've been discussing throughout the rest of my talk. Really my interest is whether we can change reasoning skills in kids. In my first study, we were able to show that just over the counter, commercially available games that you can buy at the toy store counter do improve reasoning and processing speed. So to give you a sense of what those games are, in case you have a shopping list, we played Set with these kids. We played Rush Hour, planning to get this red car out of the maze. We played Chocolate Fix, where you have different clues to arrange these different colored chocolates, as an example of all of the different games that we chose. And actually, I did this study before I did the LSAT study, and the real reason I did the LSAT study was because working in a very low-income school, I just saw shitty things happen to kids over and over and over again. And I was starting to feel like this path of research wasn't as helpful as something like policy. And I still sort of feel that I might have to jump ship at any day, but that policy is also very slow. So I didn't end up taking the LSAT. I didn't end up going to law school. And that's the story of how I got from a study like this to the previous study. This initial study was led by researchers, which is really a scalability problem. Right? So if you need researchers to play these kinds of games with kids, there are only so many kids that you can reach. So in my next study, I asked, can we integrate these games into classroom instruction first? And then the sort of more important question is, if a kid shows cognitive gains, do they also show gains on something they really care about, like academic performance, these standardized test scores? So we designed the cognitive skill instruction CSI study. We used the detective theme throughout. This was implemented at a brand new charter school. So they just had 5th grade students at the time. And this was a charter school that was like combing through the literature to find any kind of intervention they could do for these kids. So they played these games, but they also did races down the hallway to get physical activity in. They did meditation regularly. They had a very, very long school day. In fact, they were supposed to only have a 20-minute break from like 7 until 5, and we filled that break with these games. So a very intense school. And what we did is that we had the structure of the classroom was that there was a master teacher who had students who just graduated from college lead groups of 4 to 5 kids. So these adults, college graduates, were called tutors. And they played these games with kids for 20 minutes a day, 4 days a week for the entire school year. And then there was a control group with random assignment that just played typing and geography games. Let me show you our games, so you can see our detective theme here. These are very much like Set, for those of you who know it, but they're just card games. They're card games, and in this CSI Safari, the animals vary, the trees vary, the weather, you can't see it, but the background varies as well. And using these cards, you can play games about reasoning, finding 3 cards that are the same or different on each of these properties. You can play games about memory, memorize these properties and flip them over, or match properties when one card is played after another, as in like an in-back kind of game. And because we really didn't want kids to get super good at triangles and super good at squiggles or zebras and lions, we had sort of lots of different decks. This is a number deck where there are different representations of numbers, different numbers, and then different relations between the center number and the corner number. This can give you a flavor of the kind of intervention that we put together. And what we see is that our CSI group changes significantly more on a cognitive composite than the control group. But what you'll notice if you look at the y-axis is that the control group also changes from the beginning to the end of the year about 0.9 standard deviations. It's a lot. And we don't have a passive control, a fully passive control, so all of these other things that the school was doing, physical activity, the meditation, the nutrition, had 3 meals a day, we're not sure if this just represents test-retest effects or all of the other kinds of interventions that the school was including over the course of a school year. Our next question with this data was to think about who benefits the most from this kind of program. So we split the groups based on their 4th grade test scores. So an independent measure, we looked at the kids with low 4th grade test scores versus higher 4th grade test scores. And what we see is that the CSI group improves a lot more if they're in these lower score groups. So if you come into 5th grade with low test scores, low math and reading scores, then you're more likely to benefit from the CSI program. For the higher score kids, there's really no effect at all. Which is actually consistent with what I saw in my first study, which basically found the same thing. The kids who start off with the lowest scores stand to benefit the most from these kinds of game-based programs. Importantly, if we look at the CSI group, the kids who show, sorry, this isn't labeled, this is cognitive change here. The kids who showed the biggest cognitive change also showed the biggest math change. That relationship is not there for the control group, where it's completely flat. So it's not perfect, but it's some indication of transfer. For the kids who really benefited from that kind of game-based cognitive curriculum, those kids also showed some transfer to math and did better on their math tests. Okay, so I did this study with a school for a year, and the tutors hated it. They just hated it. And they hated it because, I don't know, maybe it's fun, but also because, because the kids were having so much fun. They were jumping out of their chairs. When they were winning, they were so excited, and that was not allowed at the school. Right? Which I should have known, but it was surprising to me because as a cognitive neuroscience, because I think about dopamine and motivation as being really great for brain plasticity, but it can be sort of a classroom management problem. They also felt like they didn't have a good sense of whether kids were benefiting from these games because you can't do these kinds of tests very often. So my lab has been brainstorming sort of ways to get around these problems that we have with sort of translating these interventions into the classroom. We've been talking about making tablet games to have sort of real-time feedback on skills. I think we give up a lot of those social interactions when we go to tablets, but it might be worth it for scalability. I've been collaborating with Sharon Wolf in education to think about cognitive tutoring, so to harness the power of all of these tutoring programs and train tutors how to play these kinds of games with their kids. And we've also been talking about home-based guided play interventions as a way to really start moving towards looking at brain changes as kids learn. So as an example, there's a product line called Kiwi Crate, and these are sort of self-contained science projects. This is the Kaleidoscope project that you can send home to families. And we'll add some sort of parent advice about how to get their kids to play with these games, how to get their kids to ask questions, persevere through challenges, sort of problem solve with these materials. And you can see my lab practicing here. Jasmine in particular is really into the kaleidoscope. They're really fun. It's a way to have sort of cognitive enrichment that you can send home and then look at effects in the brain. And I think we've sort of been making progress on the best ways to improve reasoning and cognitive skills more broadly. But I think we can look back to the neuroscience to think about the best time to improve these kinds of skills. So if we were to know the scales here, and we were able to know when this sort of sensitive period for abstract thought occurs, then we could potentially target right about here. So if we did our intervention here, high plasticity would be ahead of that child. So anything that you did could potentially be undone just as quickly. Okay? If you intervene as this window is closing, it's more likely that those changes would get glued into place. We're now thinking about how to determine these periods for individual kids. We're talking with scientists who study visual plasticity to think about whether these kinds of measures predict sensitive periods and abstract thought in the future, because measurement is so much easier and we can get it so much earlier. But I really think this is a promising way forward in terms of using neuroscience to inform interventions. Okay, so just to conclude, I think of all of these environmental influences as ranging on the spectrum from general to specific. So I started with the impact of income, and I found changes in cortical thickness or relationships in cortical thickness across the whole brain. Ursula found similar things in which you looked at functional connectivity. We can think about stress as influencing these emotion regulation circuits, but we also have evidence that stress affects reward circuitry, and very early stress can affect processes in the brain fairly globally. Language and school exposures are sort of intermediate, and then these cognitive interventions are really the most specific. And what I would argue is that there's really not a time at which it's too late to do these kinds of specific interventions. We just need to know how. Okay? So even in adulthood, we found that reasoning networks could change. Okay? And another thing to think about is sort of how we might want to time these different kinds of interventions based on what we know about these properties. So earlier interventions might be best in the sense that you could affect the whole shebang. Right? So if you're able to change a baby's environment, that might snowball across their lives. And when we think about factors like clean water, clean air, these factors that affect both the brain and the body, that might be the right time to intervene. Right? But at any given time, we have kids of all ages in school. Right? And so the conclusion that we just need to intervene early to take care of all of this isn't really the right place to end. Right? We also need to understand how to best change these networks in older kids and in adults.